183 will be a song after the lesson.
Good to be here this afternoon. Pretty day. Wonderful time of the year. Y'all can't see that, right? We could see it earlier.
I don't think I turned it on.
You may have turned it off.
Oh, you turned it up.
No, you may have turned it.
I didn't.
Oh, I don't know. It was up there earlier. Oh, here we go.
I may have turned it off. I think I turned it on.
Part two. No, yeah. There we go. We're warming. So initially, I was going to do a lesson on something else. One of the jump starts. I read those every morning. But last Sunday morning we started talking about willful ignorance in our class, and I decided to go that direction. So that's the direction I went. But there's an author, Leo Tolstoy. A lot of you may know who that was, but he wrote, he's a Russian writer who wrote War and Peace, wrote a lot of other stuff. But he also wrote a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. And there's a quote from that book. It says, "There's one thing and only one thing in which it is granted to you to be free in life, all else being beyond your power. That is to recognize and profess the truth." And if you look at the whole scope of why we're here on this earth, we need to recognize the truth and profess it and teach it and share it with others. That is our purpose in this life. In Psalm 119, 159 and through 60, it says, "I see the treacherous and am disgusted because they do not keep your word. Consider how I love your precepts. Revive me, O Lord, according to your loving kindness. The entirety of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous judgments endures forever." So, does God exist? Are there numerous gods? Is man his own God? Is it up to man to decide how to work out his salvation? He's got to come up with his own plan. How am I going to do this? How am I going to get to heaven if he does believe there is a heaven? Because a lot of people, I think, don't really, have a whole lot of faith that there is or is not. But is there an absolute truth, or is everything to somewhat relative? Is it kind of relative to the situation you're in, or is there an absolute truth? Is there one truth or many truths? And you gotta realize that absolute truth and relative truth are enemies. They're duking it out, day in and day out. And I'm going to tell you, there's great frustration between those two parties because each believe that they are established in the truth. If you've got two people and each one says, I'm the truth, and you got the guy over there that says I'm the truth, where's the compromise? You're not going to have a compromise. It's just going to be, bumping up again. It's kind of like magnets, trying to put those magnets together with the two negatives instead of the negative positive. It's going to you're never going to join. It's always going to be pushed apart. Each believe that they are grounded in the truth. Each views the other as either ignorant or, in some ways deceptive. So many believe that do believe in God and do believe that they're Christians, believe that, I'm a good person. I don't hurt anyone. God is not going to send me to hell. I don't need to worship him any way that he's described. I don't need to attend church. I'm a good person. And then you've got the other side that may say, well, I know you're a good person, but there's rules. God has given us rules. And those two mindsets just have a hard time reaching any kind of conclusion, you might say, because a lot of people don't want to give up that freedom of, I'm doing my own thing. They want to continue to do their own thing. So absolute truth definition is a statement that is true at all times and in all places. So 2 + 2 is 4, and a square has 4 sides, and a no circle can be a square, no square can be a circle. Those statements are true anywhere. That's going to be true on the moon. It's going to be true here. It's going to be true anywhere. So it is an absolute truth. And it's funny, because those statements are true regardless of whether they're believed or not. And that's where you kind of have an issue. That statement 2 + 2 is 4. And that's going to be true whether you believe it or not. It's always going to be that. But I would guarantee you could probably find someone to argue that point, because someone's always willing to argue that. And then you have the relative truth, where there is no objective, universal truth, applicable to everyone, everywhere. It's shaped in a lot of ways by personal experience, how you make up that relative truth. And in each person's path, we've all had different exposures in this life, so that path is different for each one of us, which would in part be our truths are different. Your truth is going to be different than my truth if you're going down the relative truth path. So example of that, some of our young people in here could probably say, roller coasters are fun. Not necessarily. Yeah, not for me. I'm not a fan. Not anymore. No, younger, yes, but at this age, no. So that would be someone's relative truth that roller coasters are fun. Well, they're not fun for me. So it's relative to the situation, relative to the person. It relies on the fact that one cannot know the truth because, in fact, there is no such thing. It is yours to make. And it's impossible to practice relative truth. And you can't really live off of that principle because there's really no basis for right or for wrong. Your right and my right are probably not the same rights, and your wrong and my wrong may not be the same wrongs. And then you run into those people that that just say, well, you do you and I'll do me. We're just gonna go down that path, and that may be okay for a while until someone decides, you've got something that I want and I'm going to take it. Well, my truth is that I can take it. What's the problem? Well, that's not my truth. You can't have my stuff. So that's not a principle that you can really live by. And some people want to say that is the truth, that there is no truth. But when you boil right down to it, it is just silly to think that, because in that situation, rights and wrongs don't really add up. And if you love your neighbor as thyself, as we're commanded to in Mark 12:31, you're going to have some care for them, and if they're practicing something wrong, it should be your job to inform them. So just saying, well, they're, you do you and I'll do me, even though I know better, that doesn't work out, because as a Christian, that's not an attitude that you can have. And in Galatians 6:1, it reads, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Consider yourself, lest you also be tempted. All of us didn't start out. A lot of us were lucky enough to be raised in the church. I was not. I was raised in several churches, but not. So I've been exposed to several per se truths, none of them being the truth. But we've all been there, and convincing someone that there is an absolute truth, that God has one plan, one truth, is difficult, and it requires a gentle touch, a very gentle touch. And I go and tell you, to me, it seems like you should just tell them, and they, oh, okay, well, sure, but in truth, that's not how it is. It takes some convincing. When I first started attending here many years ago, I didn't necessarily like what they were saying up here from the pulpit, or in the classes. It wasn't what I was taught growing up. But I was lucky enough to have a supportive wife and to be exposed to it, and I was interested to find the truth, because I'm not much on being wrong. I don't think any of us really like to be wrong. And in Proverbs 27:5-6, it says, open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. So, if you're practicing something wrong, don't you want to be told? If you're heading down the path of destruction, don't you want to be informed? You know, the kisses of the enemy, oh, everything's going to be okay. It kind of goes back to that statement, how do I look in this outfit? A friend's going to tell you, maybe you shouldn't wear that. Whereas the enemy, someone who doesn't care much, yeah, you look great. Go on, wear that out. It's the same principle when, you're living your life, your friends are going to say, or a good friend is going to say, maybe that's a dangerous path. That's a dangerous thing that you're doing, whether drinking or drugs or, living a life, unwed marriage, shacking up, fornication. If you're doing those things, a friend will tell you, you need to think about those choices. Where someone who is not grounded or, not necessarily a friend is not going to speak up. Not going to speak up. So our outline this evening, what is truth? Ignorance, we'll touch on that and a couple of types there. And then we're going to talk about deception. And then the lesson will be yours this evening. So what is the truth? In John 17:17, it says, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. So we know God's word is truth. And that's really the only basis we have. Jesus is not